It is known that Mikhail Botvinnik was very good playing with the isolated pawn, but in this game he shows an example of how to play against the isolated queen pawn, and he does it very well. At the time when the game was played, this move was considered to be almost the only move. But nowadays, in addition to pawn to c5, black also can play b6. He can also try to play something like c6, but that would be a bit too passive. In the game, black ends up with the isolated pawn, and the side with the isolated pawn should try to keep as many pieces on the board as possible. So from that point of view, it was probably better to take with the pawn on d5, keeping the knights on the board still. This is the point of white's idea behind the move pawn to d4. If he had taken with the bishop over the knight, then black would play bishop to b4, which would be kind of annoying. But the queen is pretty well placed on d4, and even though it has to retreat, it serves the purpose of recapturing with the pawn on d4. And now black is going to be suffering with the isolated pawn on d5. Now the exchange of dark squared bishops is going to be inevitable, and that's going to highlight the weakness of the dark squares around the black pawn on d5. White begins to gradually put pressure on the d5 pawn, and it's really hard to defend this kind of position for black. The position is not lost, but it's interesting to see how Botvinnik converted the advantage without giving the opponent any chances at all. So white fully improved all of his pieces. Nothing really can be placed any better. So now he begins to exchange the more pieces that are guarding the squares around the pawn. In addition to exchanging the knights, the move knight to e5 also has the idea of freeing up the f3 square for the bishop. So now more pressure can be put on the d5 pawn. Now because the pawn on d5 is pinned to the black queen on c5, white is threatening to play pawn to e4 and just win the pawn immediately. So black has to guard the queen. So it's clear that white's better here, but it took him some effort to figure out the correct winning plan. And that's why he went back and forth with the queen. And we'll see pretty soon what the winning plan is. The idea is that it's hard to increase the pressure on the d5 pawn. It's already being attacked 3 times, and it's going to be defended 4 times. But what that also means is that the white pieces are placed actively, and all the black pieces are very passive. They're all sitting, just defending the pawn on d5. And while that weakness on d5 is the only weakness, it's really hard to take advantage of it. So what white has to do here is to create the second weakness in black's position. And we'll see how and where he's gonna do that. This is the most instructive move of the game. White's basically going to open the second front, and he's gonna try to create some play on the king's side. And because all of black's pieces are tied up to defending d5, it's going to be hard for him to transfer the pieces from one side of the board to another. Whereas white's pieces like the queen on e5, the rook on d4, and the bishop on f3, they're all ready to be transferred to anywhere they want to. They're placed actively, they're not tied up to anything, and it's going to be relatively easy for white to maneuver. Whereas black is really sitting there, always threatened to lose the d5 pawn, and he can't really defend as well as white can attack. This opens up the g-file in front of the white king, but it's not really dangerous for him because the black pieces are too passive to exploit that in any way. Here obviously black cannot take on h3 because that's just going to give white a tempo to play rook h4 and then double up on the h file, which would probably result in a checkmate to the black king pretty soon. Now white's threatening all kinds of stuff. He's threatening to play rook to g4 maybe, maybe king to h1 and rook to g1. And it's easy for black to go wrong, and it's not surprising that he went wrong pretty quickly here. I guess he was trying to stop rook to g4, but the way he did that was not the best. This move is a mistake because it just weakens way too many squares, too many dark squares in the black position. It's just completely resigning himself to defending too many weaknesses, too many weak pawns that are placed on the same color as the bishop. Now white is threatening to play rook to h4, and if black plays rook to d7 to d6, then rook takes on g7 is going to win the pawn. So black has to somehow free up the escape square for his king. That's why he moves the rook away from f8. With the rook to f4, white just highlights that the pawn on f5 is another weakness. So now black has a weakness on d5, on g7, and on f5. And of course, with so many weak pawns, it's really hard to hold the game. And this is the end, because there's no way to hold the f5 pawn. It's attacked 3 times, and black cannot defend it 3 times himself. And with the collapse of the f5 pawn, the rest of black's position collapses as well, because now there's no more pawns to guard his king. Now black cannot take on a2, among other reasons, is that the d5 pawn is then falling. The last few moves were pretty desperate, and here black resigned because he's losing everything. So this is a very good example of how to first create one weakness in the opponent's position, then exchange the pieces that guard the squares around it, like the knight on c6 and the bishop on the f6 square, and then improve the placement of pieces around the weakness. Remember, white had the queen on e5 and rook on d4, and then once the opponent's pieces are completely tied up to the defense of that weakness, you can then create the second and third weaknesses in the opponent's position by transferring the play to other sides of the board. If the opponent has a weakness in the center on d5, then you attack on the king's side, and so on. And again, this game was very typical for Botvinnik's style at the time. He would just very brutally build up against the opponent's weaknesses and not give them any chance to escape.